Welcome to Speak with Eve. I'm your host, Eve Eurydice. Today's guest is Chris Hedges. Chris is a one-of-a-kind intellectual, a Cassandra-like prophet who foresaw in his many books of the last decades the election and triumphant reelection of a figurehead like Donald Trump. I'm talking about books like The Death of the Liberal Class, The Empire of Illusion, The Triumph of Spectacle, America the Farewell Tour, The End of Literacy, The Christian Right, and The War on America. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Thanks.
I have so many questions for you, but I do want to begin with the bigger picture of where you see the world going now that we have 4 years of the Trump presidency, which is like real-time live streaming presidency. Where do you see America going in the next 4 years? Where do you see the world as a result going in the next 4 years? And then in the final stretch, where do you see Palestine and the Middle East going, since that has been your focus since you've been the Middle East bureau chief, really, but especially now since October 7th?
Going where it was going before Trump took power. However awful Trump is, and he's awful, and however naked that form of authoritarianism is under Trump, and maybe even a kind of Christo-fascism, if you look at appointees like Mike Huckabee, saying that Palestine doesn't exist and calling the West Bank Judea and Samaria and all this kind of stuff. But that was all that we've been marching towards that for a few decades with the evisceration of the working class. And that's something that I have just pounded home in my books over the last 2 decades. There's a cost, a very dangerous political cost, to the disenfranchisement of the working class. I watched it in Yugoslavia, or go back to Weimar or anywhere else. When you distort a society like that, you create political distortions like Trump. He's the natural denouement of the destruction of the capitalist democratic state and the evisceration of the middle class and the severe immiseration of the working class. That's what happens. People grasp in desperation onto a figure, a demagogue who's cultish and peddles magical thinking. That's what Milosevic was, Franjo Tuđman in Croatia, Radovan Karadzic and the Serb leader in Bosnia. It's nothing new throughout history. We just don't know any history. The destruction of democratic institutions, and we can just tick them off. The Congress, which has essentially been bought, especially by the Zionist lobby, but by corporate power, by the lobbyists in Washington. The stacking of the courts with corporatists and by Trump with these loony Christian fascists, the destruction of the press, which is again become completely corporatized, the corporatization of universities. We saw over the summer all of the universities and colleges coordinated effort create these draconian rules so that even the most tepid forms of protest were outlawed. They've become academic gulags. And you can be sure that once the genocide ends, they're not going to lift those restrictions. The wholesale surveillance, which Snowden exposed, the destruction of due process, all of it, and of course the flagrant abuse of executive orders, that all predated Trump. The difference is, of course, under the old system, we still paid fealty to the iconography, language, the quote-unquote constitutional rights. It was all a facade, like the late Roman Republic. Internally, the corporations and the oligarchs had seized all of the levers of power. Now that facade has crumbled. That veneer has crumbled, and the rot has produced a Trump, a figure like Trump. It reminds me of the Snopes and Faulkner's novels that, kind of rise up out of the decayed South. But the system itself was rotten to the core before Trump got there. So Trump's the symptom, he's not the disease. Where are we going? I looked at this election as a battle between oligarchs and corporatists. And corporate capitalists want something different from oligarchs. They want stability, they want decorum, because they tend to make investments, usually overseas. They want stable trade deals. It takes a long time. It can take a long time to get a return on those investments. That's what corporatists want. And of course, like oligarchs, they want the destruction of any kind of empowerment in terms of regulations or in terms of unions that can mitigate the savage exploitation of the working class, and that there's a confluence of interests there with oligarchs. But oligarchs want chaos. They want, as Steve Bannon says, the destruction of the administrative state, because oligarchy is more about that more pure form of rentier capitalism, by which you put up toll booths. You destroy the mechanisms of the institutions of civil society. That's why they talk about abolishing the Department of Education, the for-profit healthcare system, forcing cities to sell off their utilities. I opened my book, America, the Farewell Tour, in Scranton. That's sold off its sewer system, its parking authority, its electrical system. And of course, then these private corporations, not only do they not provide good service, but they keep jacking up the rates. And there's no control. That's what oligarchs want. Embodied in figures like Bezos or Zuckerberg, it's all about creating these toll booths between you and vital services where they extract fees and create this, absurd wealth that I don't think we've seen, since pharaonic Egypt or something. People worth $200 billion. You can't even get your head around it. So that was the battle. The oligarchs won, and you see it. Trump stacking his administration with oligarchic figures who are, very funny story in the New York Times a few days ago about how there aren't any mansions left in Washington by which they can buy because they all want these kind of boutique, high-end real estate properties. So where are we headed? We're headed to a further destruction, a dismantling of what's left of civil society. It began with Clinton, the destruction of welfare, the NAFTA, the deregulation of the FCC. Well, it actually began with Carter, Reagan, and then Clinton, but Clinton turbocharged it. So that will just be put on steroids. Everything will be broken down. There will be no impediment left to really savage exploitation, not only of the American public, but of course of the natural world itself. We've seen that. Although Biden, the rhetoric of the Democrats, at least it's grounded in a reality-based universe, but they aren't any better in terms of drilling or in terms of treatment of undocumented workers, or it's just the rhetoric. The difference for a Palestinian is that it's pretty clear that Israel's moving to annex the West Bank, will resume, unfortunately, the genocide in Gaza. That will last maybe a few weeks. Israel would like to get some hostages back and would like to normalize relations with Saudi Arabia, so that pause makes both of those two things possible. But Netanyahu and, of course, the Trump administration itself has made it quite clear that should phase two in Israel, I wrote a column about this, which explains the history of it, called the ceasefire charade. But going all the way back to Camp David, Israel always signs agreements in phases. The first phase gives it what it wants, and then every other phase it refused to abide by, and that's what will happen here. The Trump administration, it wanted a kind of bombing pause for the inauguration for optics. So what's the difference? So the difference is that the Trump administration has already embraced the rhetoric of the messianic Zionists in the Netanyahu government. The Biden administration, for instance, if Israel announced, as I expected to annex the West Bank, would say that they're displeased, or they wouldn't embrace it, but it wouldn't make any difference for the Palestinians on the ground. You saw that kind of faux humanitarianism over Gaza while we were funneling $20 billion worth of weapons and arms sales, providing arms sales to further the genocide. It couldn't continue without us. Israel depleted its stockpiles of munitions long ago. I think it gets 68 or 70%. This was a couple months ago of all of its munitions are shipped to them by us. So it will be a classic oligarchic state where, and those of us, you, me, and others who dissent will become more and more marginalized. But let's be clear, I've already been. Anytime I do anything on Palestine, I'm demonetized. I get hit with algorithms, obviously, and I know that anecdotally because people sign up, and I don't run my social media, so I can't actually even see it, but Max runs it, and people will complain that they've signed up on Instagram or something else, and then my account is just deleted. So we know anecdotally that is true, but it will become more draconian. And just before I finish, let's be clear that the censorship, just as the Democratic Party is the war party, the Democratic Party has been the party that has most aggressively pushed through the kinds of censorship against dissidents, because our critique, those of us who critique the Democratic Party, are especially detested contested from the left because they can't. What can they say? They don't really have any answer. I mean, especially after this vapid, celebrity-filled, issueless campaign the Democrats ran around Harris. So it's not good, but it hasn't been good for a while. It'll be cruder. It'll be all of the measures that we have seen in terms of exploitation, in terms of censorship, in terms of the funneling of wealth upwards into the hands of this oligarchic and corporate elite will continue, but this was all in place long before Trump appeared on the political landscape.
He was very astute because he doesn't have any politics of his own. He was very good at speaking up for the working class, who were so disappointed and felt so betrayed by the Democrats, and then representing the oligarchs while he sounded like he was really against the Democrats who had been exploiting the working classes. And I think he will just, in this unpredictable way, probably do whatever seems to give him more adulation, step by step, through these 4 years. I still like the fact that there has been a turn against the Pentagon, the spending on wars abroad, the CIA, the FBI. There is a lot of what used to be called conspiracy theories that have come back, become mainstream. Even some of the resistance to RFK, to big ag, big pharma, all of these parts of what is this very strange Trump coalition have been positive in my opinion, because they have brought awareness to these issues which were really hidden by the corporatist class. The oligarchs were there anyway. They're just much more in our face now. He brought them out too because they want the fame. Things have become more clear.
This is always the tactic of fascism, or this faux populism that fascist movements embrace. When they, as you raise, when they speak about these issues, they're actually speaking a certain truth. The problem is the solution. So, he hates the CIA. Well, I hate the CIA too, but not for the same reasons. What he wants is to turn these institutions into ones that are driven by a personal loyalty to him. That's what he wants. The new Secretary of Defense, it's all about personal loyalty, which is what despotic regimes are about. And that's the trick. So the trick is, yes, the critique is right. And you're right, he does talk about the immiseration of the working class, which the Democrats don't even acknowledge. And of course, the Democrats largely are culpable. So they don't acknowledge it. They don't acknowledge their own culpability. And they don't, unlike Bernie Sanders, provide any kind of a solution. If the Democrats ran on a kind of New Deal platform, they would have destroyed Trump. But of course they didn't, and the reason they didn't is because they're a creature of corporate money. If they actually challenged corporate power, the money would get pulled, and they would lose their political positions. Because who wants Nancy Pelosi or Chuck Schumer or any of these figures? They are creations. I mean, and the power of a Pelosi or Schumer, by the way, is that they are the spigot. The money goes through them, and then it's distributed to those who are anointed by the corporations and by the Democratic elite. Yeah, you're right that he raises the right issues, but his solution is destructive in the sense that it's not about curbing the power of those institutions. It's making sure those institutions and the people who run them are personally loyal to him, and that's what all demagogues do. And in terms of the Pentagon, I can assure you there will be no cut in the Pentagon budget at all. In fact, it'll probably be increased. But again, that predates Trump. I mean, a couple years ago, the Biden administration sent in a proposed budget for the Pentagon, and the Congress, they actually increased it, even though the Pentagon didn't even ask for it, by $40 billion. I mean, it's utter insanity. So that is the trick. The trick is they actually speak to the very real problems that we face and the very real suffering that we face and the corruption of these institutions, but the solution is as bad or worse.
They just put Band-Aid wherever they can, like they will now with a natural disaster, right, in California or in North Carolina. And people think that there has been improvement, or, we'll buy Bitcoin, and people think that that's revolutionary, or, freeing Ross Albright. I mean, there are little symbolic moves, but the big action, as you said, is this mass deregulation, which takes away protections from the population. This has become very top-down. Both parties see seem to be controlled from the top, so they're not democratically run themselves. So no one can rise up through the ranks who speaks for the people because they have, the population behind them. But what happens after Trump? He managed to win by doing this kind of like Trump-like performance, this pretty excellent world-class performance. What happens after he's gone? You think this kind of the corporatists versus the billionaire oligarchs?
I think the Democratic Party is dead, and you saw that in the postmortems. It is totally incapable of any kind of self-criticism, self-reflection. It is as non-reality based as the Trump cult in the Republican Party. They're both non-reality based systems. And you saw that in the Democratic Convention. I mean, it might as well, a meeting of the Soviet under Stalin in the 1930s, and people were being interviewed at the convention, what policies by Harris do they support? They couldn't answer because she didn't have any. I mean, she didn't have any issues other than having Beyonce and Oprah. And it was just insane. The Democratic Party's finished. Republican Party is a cult. What happens? Well, what happens is that as the public realizes that they're being betrayed, which is all fascist entities, it'll be a kind of Christian fascism, which I wrote about in my book, American Fascists. I mean, they fill the ideological void. Trump has no ideology. He's just a grifter. He doesn't have any ideology of his own. So they'll fill it with these Mike Huckabees, these kind of figures. So what happens is that as people feel increasingly betrayed, then the repression becomes more and more draconian. And it's already there again. I mean, who was it who militarized police? I mean, you walk down a street in an American city, and these people are outfitted with long-barreled weapons and Kevlar vests and armored personnel carriers. You're Greek. I mean, I don't know if you remember the military dictatorship in Greece. It's not unfamiliar that's what I saw in military dictatorships around the world. So the repression will become worse. And the system is calcified, that it doesn't have the capacity to carry out reform within itself. And then you create a kind of polarization where you have, what militancy there exists outside of the formal structures of the state. Repression will be very severe if you attempt to mobilize against the state. And, we will look like all of these other despotic regimes. I mean, Bibi Netanyahu is a war criminal, of course, like Biden. Bibi Netanyahu, he's not stupid. And he says, everybody thinks the world has this trajectory towards liberalism and democracy and openness. No, we're moving, and that's why he builds relationships with figures like Orban. We're moving towards a kind of global police state and a kind of replication of China's totalitarian capitalism. That's where we are moving. Once the glow comes off with Trump, and once people realize that they've been, it's a sham in the same way that Trump's fake universities or, everything else that his casinos or anything else he's invested in his whole life is a sham, a way to essentially prey on people's despair, really, then the very harsh mechanisms that are in place will be used. I mean, so if you go back to the Obama administration, 2011, the end of that year, Obama signed into law Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act, which came into effect at midnight. And he did it in a way that he thought no one would notice. I and some lawyers did notice. It overturned the 1878 Posse Comitatus Act, which prohibits the federal government from using the military as a domestic police force. And we sued him in federal court in Manhattan, in the Second Circuit. We actually won, much to the amazement of everybody. That judge, by the way, has since left the bench. And then the Obama administration freaked out. They sent lawyers from the NSA to demand that the judge issue a temporary injunction, meaning lifting the ban. And we wondered why. Why did they react with such urgency? And I think it's only because if you went to some of our black sites, like at Bagram or anywhere else, you probably had dual nationals, Americans in there, American Afghans. That's my guess. I don't know. And so then it went up to the appellate court. The appellate court for months didn't rule on it because it's a very clear black and white legal issue. It was illegal. The appellate court didn't know what to do. And the way they always push through these kinds of legal distortions is to deny the standing of the person who brought the case to the court. So it was called Hedges versus Obama. So how are they going to deny my standing. Well, they waited until the Supreme Court ruled on a case called Clapper versus Amnesty International, which was about the state surveillance of journalists. This was before the Snowden revelations, and the federal attorneys said that these journalists who brought the case had no right to bring the case. They had no standing to bring the case, because if the federal government was carrying out surveillance of journalists, they would be informed. If you can believe anything that absurd, and the Supreme Court bought it. I mean, we now know with Snowden that, of course, it was a lie, and they threw the case out, and then immediately the appellate court in New York said, well, Hedges doesn't have standing in Clapper versus Amnesty International, therefore he doesn't have standing in Hedges versus Obama, and they threw it out. We filed a cert, this is a petition to the Supreme Court to hear the case. They turned us down, and it's law. That was all Obama. But it means that Trump, when he wants to, can call active duty military onto the streets of American cities, and it's even more draconian than that. They can seize people and hold them without due process until, quote unquote, the end of hostilities, whenever that is. I mean, essentially, it's extraordinary rendition on the streets of American cities. That was a Democratic initiative. It had nothing to do with Trump. Trump wasn't even on the political scene then, and that's the problem. They have given both the Bush administration, although I would argue Obama's assault on civil liberties was worse than Bush. They have given somebody immense powers, in essence, the powers of a dictator, and that has Trump doesn't have to create it. He doesn't have to seize it. He already has it. That's what's so scary.
In fact, to his credit, he did not preemptively pardon himself last time, and Biden went ahead and established precedent now. So preemptively pardon your wholly means that in the future, any president can do whatever he wants through his representatives, and then at the end, preemptively pardon everyone who worked for him, and they're all beyond.
Yeah, although the Supreme Court ruled, in essence, in Trump's favor to give him that immunity.
That was for him, but not
for him. Yeah.
But it's not like what Biden did with those preemptions. Preemptive pardon now make it possible for a president to actually preemptively pardon his entire administration at the end of 4 years.
Yeah, so, that's a good point. I mean, so that's, again, a Democratic initiative. And it's a way to absolve anybody from any legal accountability at all. That was a gift of Biden. But look, I always detested Biden. I teach in the prison system. Half of my students wouldn't be there but for Biden and Clinton. Remember that in that whole 1994 omnibus crime bill, it doubled the size of the prison population. It was Biden. He expanded death penalty crimes in the federal prison from like 2 or 3 to about 50. He and Clinton militarized the police forces. And it was this 3 strikes you're outlaw. So not only through quote unquote enhancement are people serving these insane sentences. I mean, Leonard Peltier, who, by the way, is innocent, I worked in Pine Ridge, spent 50 years in prison. You know, the Gabriel Princip, who assassinated the Archduke Ferdinand and his wife in Sarajevo, precipitating World War I, got a 20-year sentence. I mean, the size of the sentences, I mean, the utter dysfunctionality of the court system, the idea that you can lock people up for life for nonviolent drug offenses. I mean, this is just lunacy. This has nothing to do, this was, the Republicans signed on for it, but it was all done by Clinton and Biden. I know Biden's very, very dirty. He's very dirty. And I mean, they used to call him Senator Credit Card because he was just a tool of the credit card industry, which is based in Delaware, in Wilmington. No, he's awful. And if you go back, I mean, he opposed abortion. He called for the invasion of Iraq 5 years before we invaded. He was just terrible, terrible, terrible. So he's kind of the poster child for the decay.
I think that's why Trump won this time. I think there was like a massive protest vote against Biden, and the Democrats are not accepting it. They're not actually figuring out.
26%, I think it was, right, of the people who said that they had voted for Biden said they wouldn't vote for Harris because of the genocide.
Yeah.
And that came out before. It came out before the election. Well, the Democrats didn't even care. I mean, they're so clueless.
Then
they live in.
They brought in Liz Cheney. Their response was to embrace Liz
Cheney. Dick Cheney, a war criminal who left office with a 13% approval rating, and they revel in his embrace. I mean, but it just shows how it's like the Forbidden City or Versailles or the Court of the Tsar. I mean, what happens is there's these people encase themselves in or cocoon themselves in these worlds where they only talk to each other. And we have to say the media, of course, is a part of that apparatus where it just amplifies back to them what they want to hear. We're in deep trouble. We're in deep, deep decay. I don't know where we're all going to move to. Lesbos. I don't know. Where are we?
Lesbos is still the same way it was 4,000 years ago. There's no industry. There is like no street names or numbers. We have water, we have fish, we have good earth. So,
there you go. I just don't speak. I don't speak. Well, actually, I studied biblical Greek, but that's not going to help me in Greece. I can read the road signs. That's about it.
I don't know if you heard Sam Altman say that society is going to be completely reconfigured because of AI, which means that we will follow the Chinese in this permanent surveillance state.
That's right. Yeah, that's the model. And you know who understood this was Julian Assange, who I know, of course, and visited. But Julian totally grasped how, with the creation of the internet, there would be an initial kind of opening, but that it would gradually, corporate and oligarchic control would essentially intrude upon the internet. And he does this in his book, Cypherpunks, which was written years ago, that in the end, it would be the most efficient forms of mass surveillance and totalitarian system in human history. And of course, I was in East Germany. I covered the Stasi state. So, and he's right. That's kind of that is where we're headed. I mean, I spent a lot of time in Occupy Wall Street. All of them were using social media to communicate. Of course, after Obama, in a nationally coordinated campaign, shut down all the encampments, I watched as the security state picked off all of the main figures, and they got the right people. I know, because I knew who they were. And it's because they'd already exposed themselves. So we're talking about, it was not well reported, but raids on lofts in the middle of the night where former Occupy activists were, and all of the electronics were seized. Fake charges, they would always charge them, like one of the leaders got charged with assault with a deadly weapon against a police officer. They claimed he had a pair of scissors. I mean, the whole thing was manufactured. Now, in Zuccotti, they had platforms where they filmed. It wasn't even hidden. They had police platforms with cameras where they filmed 24 hours a day. But of course, when he was brought to trial, I went to his trial, they didn't have video of that because it didn't happen. But what they do is they didn't put him in jail. They gave him 6 years probation, which meant the next time he did any kind of organizing, he's finished. And that's, by the way, what they've done to the students who've stood up against the genocide on the campuses. Even some faculty, like Ruha Benjamin, great professor at Princeton, she's teaching on probation. So they're saying, next time you open your mouth, next time you do anything, and they mean it. And of course, there are faculty, like at Columbia, who are out.
I think that the stranglehold here is that we are hostages of this rentier capitalism system. Speaking of Lesbos, it's a plan B, but 99.9% of Americans don't have a plan B, and you need money to live. So the first thing is...
You have a house? Don't you have a house in Lesbos? So
I do.
I've got a place to go.
You have a plan.
I don't know. I'd have to probably prune your vegetable garden or something.
People no longer can grow their own food. People no longer can live off the land in any way. Everything is becoming bigger and more corporate. You need money to live, and in order to get paid, you have to shut up and obey.
That's right. Yeah. I have a certain independence because I don't actually work for a corporation. I have a certain freedom. They come at me in all sorts of ways, but it is a luxury in a sense, you're right, that most people don't have. I did a talk once in Toronto with Margaret Atwood, the great novelist. So she spoke before me and she said to the audience, it was during, we were denouncing the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And she said, Chris and I have a freedom you don't have. So don't beat yourself up. You do have to pay your rent. You use the word hostage. She didn't use the word hostage, but that's essentially what she was saying. You are hostage. And that's true, that I can get up and say stuff that would be devastating to many people who don't have anywhere else to go. They need that paycheck. And that's why I think, people like us have a kind of responsibility to speak out, because we have a certain amount of autonomy right now. They can take it away eventually, but a certain amount of autonomy that at this point most people don't have. Corporate structures are basically fascist. They're completely hierarchical. You can't express any political opinion. You are monitored. They have all your emails. They own your emails. They have their internal security. Cornel West and I did the People's Hearing of Goldman Sachs, then we marched on Goldman Sachs and blocked it. And it was really interesting when Cornell didn't get arrested, but I did. What was really interesting is that when they came to arrest us, there was a complete fusion from the Goldman Sachs security team and the police. They all knew each other. They all worked together. They were completely in tandem. And we know that the New York City police had set up a kind of command and control center. And all these guys at Goldman Sachs are ex-cops, ex-FBI. Actually, Goldman Sachs hired at one point, I don't know if he's still there, but they hired the head of MI5. So it's that corporate control is completely enmeshed in the control of state security. That was really interesting to watch, that familiarity. I mean, there was also a really funny moment because they knew who I was. They were quite rough it was really rough. They were grabbing these kids in the Occupy movement and really throwing them onto the cement and all this. It was not pleasant. All we were doing was seated. And all the employees at Goldman Sachs had rushed down with their cell phones to take pictures of us like we were animals in a zoo. But when they came to arrest me, one of the white shirts came over, the officers, and said to the blue uniform cops, "Don't cuff him in front of the cameras." They didn't want the image. They cuffed me in the van, but not till I was climbing in the back of the van. So, boy, Big Brother is pretty far advanced. And Trump will use it. I mean, when his base, like all the people who buy Trump steaks or went to his casino, actually, when I wrote America the Farewell Tour, I wrote it out of the Trump casino, which is falling apart. It was a complete, there were rats. It was a total decay. And I thought, that's exactly, once he was elected, I thought that's exactly where America's going to end up. People were shooting up in the elevators. It was closed, and there was mildew in the rooms. I think they tore it down eventually. I can't remember, but I wrote it out of Trump. I wrote it out of Trump casino. Just by accident, and that's where we're going.
What about World War III, though? What about China versus America? And it's like Godzilla versus Superman, and it's like our billionaires versus their billionaires.
Regain a lost hegemony. That's what the Athenian Empire did in Sicily. And their entire fleet got sunk, and most of their hoplites got taken prisoner and worked in quarries for the rest of their lives. So that's what happens. And then you saw spontaneous outbursts of rebellion throughout the Athenian Empire. That's what always happens in empires, whether it's the Austro-Hungarian Empire committing suicide in World War I, or, of course, the Tsarist Empire in Russia. They vainly engage in military fiascos, debacles, one after the others. And that's what we've done. You go back to Vietnam, a debacle, but more recently, Syria, 20 years in Afghanistan and Iraq. This is utter insanity. Completely counterproduction. Libya, Ukraine, the proxy war in Ukraine. So they, as we decline and China rises as a world power, there will be more and more pressure to respond militarily, which, may finish us off or may result in nuclear war. It's possible.
Definitely finish democracy off. There will be the end of democracy for a period, at least.
Democracies, if you look at world history, democracies are the exception, not the rule.
Plato said that it was a flawed form of government. It leads to tyranny.
Yeah, I don't want to get into Plato, especially with a Greek speaker, but I think Plato was kind of a fascist. He was all into the vanguard, and which Lenin loved. And I go back to Aristotle.
Plato went back to oligarchy. He couldn't figure out a better system. So if you don't want anarchy, tyranny, populist tyranny, you have to go to enlightened tyranny, which is the oligarchy.
It wasn't the oligarchy built on money. It was the oligarchy built on the philosopher king, who looked, of course, a lot like Plato. So let's be honest here. So it wasn't quite the same as oligarchy. It was an elite built around higher education. That gets into the fatal flaw of the Enlightenment, that we can transform society through education, but then, of course, when certain segments of society refuse to be educated, this is what you get with the Jacobins, we eradicate, which then morphs into Stalinism and everything else. So I love Plato, and I read him. I've read him many times. What Plato understood, which is important, is that all systems decay. And so Plato's response is how to halt the decay. I don't think his solution is right, but I think he's right about the inevitable decay.
Yeah, how to delay the decay as much as you
Yeah.
can, living in a period very much like our own in Athens. And then
Yeah.
Aristotle was the tutor of Alexander. That's the first global empire that we have, at least in the West, and it hasn't brought us much good. The Macedonians led to the Romans led to the Brits.
You're just still bitter because the Macedonians occupied Greece, so.
Yeah. Well, no one really occupied Lesbos.
Oh, okay.
We have been continuously inhabited and hardly ever occupied until the Turks. The Turks were a little brutal because by then the Byzantines had made us Christians and the Turks didn't like that.
There's one of my favorite war novels was written by a journalist from Lesbos, Life in the Tomb. He fought in the Balkan Wars and the First World War, anti-war novel. Yeah, he's from Lesbos.
It was called the Island of Poets, so it always
Oh.
gave a free refuge to poets around the Greek world. When Mycenae fell with the death of Agamemnon at the hands of his wife and her lover, the soldiers from Troy and everybody else who did not want to fight on behalf of Mycenae emigrated to Lesbos and started singing about the history in Troy, which then Homer heard, and the rest is history. The description of that war, of the Trojan War, still describes war today.
Yeah.
You could say that the Olympian gods who were in favor of the Trojans are, let's say, the corporatists or the Democrat leaders, and the Olympian gods who were in favor of the Greeks are like the oligarchs or the Republican elites, and they are overseeing the fight, and meanwhile we're like the foot soldiers dying and being killed on their behalf while they're entertained by our shenanigans on the streets.
When I looked it up, Life in the Tomb, 1924, Stratus Matavilis.
Stratus Matavilis, yes.
Isn't that what I just said? So, when I was taken prisoner in Iraq, I had in my pocket a copy of the Iliad. And the reason that I like the book so much is because, yes, it is true that the gods would take sides, but then they'd wake up the next morning and totally abandon you. And that's a better understanding of fate. How you can, be victorious one day, lucky one day, and then decimated the next. I mean, I think that's the power of Homer, whoever Homer was. We won't get into that. But that's why I find it such a really good book on war. And the other reason I like the Iliad is because it understands that people who are really good at war are really deformed, messed up individuals, like Achilles, and that they can't ever fit back into civil society. And the whole story of the Odyssey really is that struggle, and it's quite open by Odysseus to curb himself of his warrior proclivities in order to reintegrate back into civil society. In fact, I would say that the Iliad and the Odyssey are more sophisticated in terms of their understanding of war and human reality and the nature of the divine, the way the divine can turn on us. This is the theme of Melville's Moby Dick. The divine is really a menacing figure in Moby Dick. And having spent a lot of my life in war, I can tell you that is a far more accurate portrayal of human existence than the very Pollyannish Christian texts I got fed in divinity school.
I love the idea of the Odyssey as penance.
It is.
Spent 10 years.
It's penance. It's not too rough. He's with Circe, so he's getting a lot of stuff Penelope wasn't. So, but yeah, it is penance, and of course, all of the other warriors die. He's the only one who survives, and it's because of their hubris. They can't let go of their hubris.
And he had been an unwilling participant, as had Achilles. And they both had disguised themselves in women's clothes, trying to avoid being drafted. Trying to kind of avoid the vow that they took, which is the vow of patriarchy. Vow of patriarchy is you cannot take the wife, the woman of another man, A, and B, you must die. You must agree to die for the sanctity of marriage, which is patrilineage.
But then the power of it gets flipped on its head when Agamemnon gets murdered by Clytemnestra. I did study classics, So that's the power of Greek myth. That's why Freud was obsessed with Greek myth. That it grappled with all of these realities in mythic form. But most religious texts, including the Bible, are mythic. There's a real truth, underlying truth in all of this stuff.
We can conclude it somewhere here, unless you have something else you want to leave us with.
That I don't think the ceasefire is going to last. I mean, that's part of the darkness that all of us who've spent a lot of time, I spent 7 years covering Gaza and the Israeli and the settler colonial project and that. So with the relief of the ceasefire, I think we're all walking this tightrope over a pit of despair because they're not even close to done.
Northern Gaza is going to be like a vacation home, like
Yeah.
Dubai.
Oh, yeah, that's right. They've already announced it, and
the fight goes on.
we have to fight back. We have to fight back every way possible. I have a book coming out in the end of February, taken from essays on the genocide called A Genocide Foretold. I'm going back to the Middle East. I've been in the Middle East quite a bit since October 7th.
Yes, you have, yeah.
But I'm doing a book with Joe Sacco on the ground.
Thanks for being here, and everyone there, thank you for listening. And until next week, keep speaking up.
Thanks for having me.